My name is Monk Rowe. We're in Orlando, Florida. I'm very privileged to have Marty Morell with me today, and I'm going to introduce you as a man who wears lots of hats, including the cap you have on today.
Right. I'm a hat man.
Yeah, and drummer, percussionist, vibist, band leader,
Somewhat.
teacher.
Yeah. Professor at
Did
the
you
University of Central Florida.
Did you have a career path as a young man that was inspired by something?
Not really. I just knew that I wanted to be a musician, like at a very early age. 14 years old, I went to a big show at the Paramount Theater there in Broadway. And I was just in awe. I saw the drummer up there playing behind all. That was Alan Freed. I don't know if you rock and roll fans out there.
Sure.
You know? And it was just a great show, right? And then in the backup band, I was watching. My eyes was fixated on that drummer, and I thought, wow, that is so cool. I want to do that.
That's where they'd have guys come out and do a couple hits, and the bands would back them up.
Yeah.
Right? And then the next guy would come out.
Right. Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers, and the Platters, and Chuck Berry even was on that show, and all those. Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers. Did I say that already? Yeah, Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers.
Right, Frankie Lyman, yeah.
Yeah, and that was it. I knew right then and there. That was 1958. I had started playing drums in school, and I said, "That's it. That's it for me." And then, actually, what really was the kind of the final, decision maker was. I got my first gig, right, and the gig paid $10, right, and when I tell the story to my friends, and they laugh because this guy I was playing with, an accordionist, he calls me, he says, Marty, we got a gig, and I said, well, great. I said, well, how much does they pay? He says, it pays $8. And I said, oh man, I said, you think we can get a little bit more money? He says, my very first gig, I'm already asking for more money, right? So all my friends already, they know me, and I'm always asking for more money, even today, right? But actually, so he did pay me the $10.
Okay,
so it worked.
It's worth
right?
asking.
So then after that, we did a second gig like a month later, right? For the Knights of Columbus, and it was a dance and everything, and I made $25.
What year would this have been?
That would have been 1958.
And that's not a bad amount of money for doing something.
Listen, my dad was making $60 a week.
Oh, man.
In those days, and that was a pretty good gig, right? So for me, to make $25, not only that, but I was playing music, and they fed us at a great meal. And I said, man, sign me up. This is it. I'm in. I'm totally in.
So what was the song list like on that kind of gig?
Well, the old standards, Don't Blame Me, Foggy Day, like all those old show tunes.
If someone had come up and said, you guys play a rumba, would you have known what to do at that point?
Yeah.
Why?
Well, because this accordionist, a friend of mine, he taught me some rhythms, because he was working in a studio, a Joe Biviano accordion studio in Manhattan, right? And there was a drum teacher there, and he went and got the information from the drum teacher, and the drum teacher taught him, and then he taught me.
That's neat, because you don't always have to learn from people who are playing the same instrument as you.
Right. So he was a great friend. That was my first musical experience. Like working professionally, right? And the thing for me is that I felt very natural. It came easily. I could always hear the rhythms and hear what to do as a drummer, right? And the people ask me, why are you a musician? And I said, well, I became a musician by default because I wasn't good at anything else. Music was what I was good at. And so I developed a sense of identity in music like really early.
Were your parents supportive of this path?
Yeah, they were. But my dad, my mom she's Puerto Rican. She used to sing in Puerto Rico, as a young girl, and I think she loved music, and my dad too. My dad was a businessman. He said, "Look, okay, if you want to be a musician, that's great, but get an education." And I said, "Okay, that sounds good." So then I followed that path, and I went to Manhattan School of Music, and I studied at Juilliard, the percussion at Juilliard, and that served me well. And it was nice that they were behind what I wanted to do.
Did it ever occur to you to become a percussionist in a classical symphony orchestra?
Well, at the time when I was in school, I played with the National Orchestra Society there in Manhattan. It was an orchestra of all the students from Juilliard and Columbia University and a lot of the music departments. So I played with the orchestra, and I thought, wow, this is great. I was really kind of enthralled with that beautiful sound, orchestral sound. But I was in a percussion section. I was one of maybe 5 or 6 guys. And this was during the school year, right? So, and then on holidays and in the summers, I was doing little gigs like up in the Catskill Mountains, and I started having fun doing that. And I said, "Wow, this is a lot cooler. This is fun. This is easy. So, and of course, I started playing shows early, right? So I was reading charts at 14, 15 years old. I was getting that kind of experience. And I was making money doing it, so, become a professional musician to earn a living, right? So it seemed like I just naturally rolled into that position.
There's a lot of downtime that you're a percussionist in an orchestra, isn't there?
Absolutely. Yeah, you count like 100 bars, and you get ready to play your 2 little triangle notes, right? Then the conductor stops. He says, "Okay, let's take it back to letter A." Then you got to count all over again, right? And you're waiting like that, it's that kind of thing. So
Yeah.
I mean, it was exciting. At the time, it was really exciting, I really enjoyed it. I really learned a lot. Of course, I was just auxiliary percussion. I played cymbals and bass drum, and suspended cymbal triangle, woodblock, and that kind of thing, and some snare drum. But the percussion section was headed by Morris Goldenberg, who was a percussion teacher at Juilliard and in Manhattan. He had students from both schools. So he was the head of the percussion department there for the orchestra, the National Orchestral Society, right in New York. And so, I mean, it was a great experience to be there, and under his guidance. So.
I want to take you back to the Alan Freed show. I'm sort of fascinated by that period where music was moving from basically swing-based to straight eighth notes.
Right.
Were you aware of that, both sides of that coin?
Yeah,
at the time?
Somewhat. People ask me, how do you think it got to where it was straight? It's like straight eighth notes. Well, I think perhaps the Latin music is more eighth note based. Like you take a cha-cha, which is da 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 da, right? And that music kind of infiltrated the musical scene, right? And then so the combination of the two, then they started to add those elements, and perhaps that's how the even eighth note feel got started. And then another possibility is that playing swing is kind of a difficult to get that feel, right? And maybe some drummers thought it was easier. They started playing more on the eighth note side, or like those early days, like when they were the shuffle kind of early rhythm and blues, right? It might have morphed into an even more even eighth feel, right? So it's a combination of a few things, I think, that caused that to happen.
Yeah. Is there such a thing as playing behind the beat or ahead of the beat?
Well, you hear that a lot. I think the main thing is finding where it grooves, where it feels best. You know, and certain tunes, you know, certain, you know, like in the Ellington Band, right? I had the good fortune to work with the Ellington Band for about 6 years, 6.5 years. And, you know, it's a more laid back kind of feel, like especially on like something like Jeep's Blues or even Satin Doll, you know, with that band. It's laid back, but it really grooves. And it's not really behind the beat, it's just in a place where it really feels good, right? Mm-hmm. And then it depends on the tempo, you know. I mean, you're not going to lay back if you're playing an up tempo. You know what I mean? It's right. The tempo is pushing you forward, so you got to, you know, keep driving it, right? Yeah. But certain kinds of music lend themselves to like a little more, you know, laid back style, right? And that's kind of how I approach it. But basically, you just try to get it feeling good wherever it sits, you know, and that's the place, you know, I try to get to every time I play, you know.
Is it partly the bass player you're working with that, well, let me rephrase. It seems like there'd be bass players that you work better with and some that it just doesn't jive.
That's true. But for the most part, you know, if a guy's a professional, you know, then you just kind of, you know, take care of your job description, you know, and trying to make the music feel good, right? Okay. That's what a bass player and drummer are supposed to do together. They're supposed to work together as a team, mm-hmm. right? If you get clashing egos, that could be a problem, right? But, you know, I believe that when you play music, you got to leave your ego home. You know, and you need to serve the music and forget about your own personal agenda, you know. And your agenda should be to make that particular music sound and feel as good as you can, especially in a rhythm section, right? So, yeah, there's some bass players that, you know, I love playing with for certain kinds of music. When I was with the Ellington Band, Hassan Shakur, bass player, he played with that band for over 35 years. And he works with Monty Alexander now. And he actually won Ted Mack's Amateur Hour. He was 3 years old playing bass. Do you remember that show?
I do.
Yeah, yeah. So, but he is just, for that kind of music, he is just the best. He's the easiest, and just, it's so easy to play with him, especially in those kind of Ellington-style grooves. Mm-hmm. You know, it was a pleasure to work with him.
It's interesting that the band has retained that kind of feel, with some of the key players having, you know, passed away or whatever.
Right.
You don't have Johnny Hodges there anymore, but right. If they're still laying back, as you say.
Well, the thing is, you know, that band is actually it's the original, from the original times when Duke started it, right? So, you know, it would go along, and then when somebody died, you know, that position got filled, right? So they kept everything going. You know, when Duke passed and Mercer took over, and some of the guys that had worked with Duke was still stayed in the band, so it was kind of always passing the flag to the next person, right? So you know, that there was a certain way to play in that band, and that's what, you know, if you could do that, then that's how you got the gig. That type of thing, right? So I'm honored to have been part of that Ellington legacy. You know, even though actually I worked with Barry Lee Hall. Barry Lee Hall unfortunately passed away a few years ago. He was a trumpet player, and he worked with Ellington. All right, so he was the last connection.
I see. And
also Rocky White, the drummer. Duke Ellington himself hired Rocky, right? And he was with the band. It's like 38 years or something like that, right? So to get a position in that band, somebody has to die, right? Then you get a position.
That's right. There's the Ellington never fired anyone, I guess. That's at least what I've read.
Well, I guess it's true because if the cats accepted you, wanted you, then you're up to the task. You're up to playing the right way. I actually resigned about 4 or 5 years ago because I thought, I'm going to leave on my own terms. I'm not going to wait till I die. Yes.
I have other things I can do.
Well, actually, I just didn't want to do the traveling anymore, and I felt it was better for the band to get somebody that could do all the gigs, And so last year I did a few gigs. They were here in Florida, and the drummer couldn't make it, so I filled in.
Oh, nice.
So, you get tired of the traveling.
Yeah. Do you ever have any problems figuring out what to play behind the bass solo? There's a lot of bad jokes floating around about, oh, here comes the bass solo. Everybody's going to start talking and stuff.
Yeah.
And it's weird because everybody tends to stop, and the bass player's got to carry the whole thing. And when I think about if I was a drummer, I don't know what I would do either.
Well, the main thing is just to kind of keep the groove going. I know when I played with Hassan, with Ellington, he always liked it when I played. Just keep a nice background, feel happening. You're not going to get too busy or too loud because you don't want to cover him up.
Right.
But once in a while, pianists will drop in a couple of things, and that's nice. It makes an interesting bass solo, right? I just kind of follow along as if it was any soloist.
Yeah.
Right, but you got to take into consideration the volume, and you usually play on the hi-hat, type of thing. Although when I was working with Eddie Gomez and Bill Evans, I'd play straight ahead like it was a more modern kind of a feel, right? So, and Eddie played like a saxophone or any other horn. He was so ridiculous, like with his technique and everything.
Yeah.
So, I played behind him as though I was playing behind a sax or something, So that was a different style altogether.
Yes.
Right. So you got to always take that into consideration too. Whatever style, whatever tune, whatever groove you're playing, that also figures into how you handle playing drums behind a bass solo.
Did Bill Evans ever give you instructions or things he'd like to hear? Could you do this instead of what you're doing? Did you hear much from him? Never.
Absolutely. The only thing he said to me one time was, you might think about adding a third cymbal, just to maybe get a different, just to be able to switch over to a different sound. Because I had a ride cymbal, and then I actually had what at the time was a flat ride made by Pasty. Right. It's a particular sound that it's never overpowering. Right. And actually, I switched to. This is kind of a funny story. I met Bill's mother at the Kennedy Center. We did a concert there, and there was a little reception afterwards, and I met Bill's mother. Right. And Bill introduces me, and she said, "Oh, the first thing she said to me, oh, the drums were too loud. I couldn't hear Bill." That was all I remember. She didn't say, "Oh, hi, how are you?" Nothing. The drums were too loud. So I guess I took it to heart, and then I heard about these flat ride cymbals, and so I got to deal with Pasty at the time. I started endorsing Pasty cymbals, and they made the flat ride, right? So I picked one up, and that's the cymbal that's on pretty much all the recordings that I did with Bill. I used that flat ride, and it made it really easy in a concert hall to I could dig in and never really kind of cover up the piano, right? That had a lot of definition too, which is so it made it easy. I could didn't have to worry.
It's got to be hard to try to dig in but not play, but not at the same time.
Right. But actually now I think I have more control, where I could do that easier. Back then, that youthful kind of energy that you just want to go for it all the time. It just made it easier. I could free up. I didn't have to worry about if I playing too loud.
Yeah. I think I've read that, or heard, seen, that you were well prepared for that gig before you got it,
Yeah, that's true.
because you had, checked them out seriously.
Well, the thing is, I became a huge fan of Bill Evans.
Mhm.
I first heard a Portrait in Jazz in maybe 1961, something like that. And a bass player friend of mine in high school, he played it for me, and I said, "Wow, this is some of the most beautiful music I ever heard." And I became a huge fan. Like the next day, I went out and bought whatever I could find, LPs, right? And I started to listen to Bill a lot. The early trio with Scott LaFaro and Paul Modian,
Yeah.
right? And all the cats at that time were just in love with that trio. It was just the most beautiful thing to hit the scene. So it was my favorite jazz group at the time, and I never thought that I would one day be the drummer. But some years later, the opportunity presented itself, and so I had a chance to play with Bill at the Vanguard. He was auditioning drummers, right? So I went down and played on a Thursday night, and anything he played, I knew his book. So I think that kind of surprised him. Anything he threw me, and then after the gig he said, "Wow," he said, "sounds like you've been playing with us for a long time." And I said, "Well, in some ways I have, So because I've listened so much, and it seemed like everything clicked. It was one of those nights where everything worked.
Nice.
And it was really nice. So next day his manager called me and he said, "Do you have a passport?" So I knew I had a gig, So it was nice. That was a thrill. It really was.
Wow.
It was a great time.
Was it hard to watch? You had health problems when you were through those years, right?
Yeah.
It's hard to watch that.
Well, through those years, you would never know it. And Bill was always very cool and always seemed in control of everything. He was a gentleman. He was very took care of business. I think it was later on, actually, he got a little bit, or maybe. I would have never known had I not known through the other cats that told me. It wasn't really that obvious.
Uh-huh.
But I guess just before he got on the methadone program, you could see that he was a little bit. It was becoming an even bigger problem.
Did it affect his playing at that point that you knew?
Not really.
Mm-hmm.
Not really. And I think if he was feeling sick, it might have affected his playing, a little bit, But he always took care of business. He was very professional that way, He always, whatever, honored any contract or any engagement, and he would always make sure that he took care of what needed to be taken care of.
Yeah.
And very responsible that way.
It's unfortunate that jazz, especially in the 50s and somewhat in the 60s, I guess, was so associated with drug abuse.
Yeah, that's right.
And all that. Sometimes I tell people, well, look where people went to work. They went to work in a bar very often, and the surroundings.
Well, back then they didn't know like what they know now about excessive use of those drugs. Back then they didn't really. The thing with smoking, everybody smoked, right? Now, like 60, 70 years later, it's no, man, that's really bad. You shouldn't smoke,
Mm-hmm.
But back then everybody was smoking.
Yeah.
So I just finished reading a Miles Davis autobiography, and it goes into all that with Charlie Parker and Bud Powell and all that stuff, what those guys were going through, it was terrible. I mean, it'd break your heart when you read some of that, you know. And you say, well, no wonder why they self-medicated, you know, just to get through. That was a very difficult time for the music too, as well, right? For jazz music.
Yeah. Did you resign from the trio?
Yeah, I did. Right.
Was there a reason for that?
Well, again, I was tired of the road, and I wanted to expand and try to do some different things.
Yeah.
You know, I love Bill. I love the music, and but I also financially it wasn't the best. Okay, it was you know, I survived. It was okay, you know, but I knew I had other abilities, and I wanted to be able to, you know, buy a house and, you know, plan for the future a little bit. I knew I couldn't do that if I stayed on the road with Bill Evans, you know. And after almost 7 years, I thought,
it's a long time to do anything, actually.
Yeah.
Well, if you don't mind me asking, what was your typical? Were you on a salary?
Well, you know, back then, you know, say if we worked the top of the gate of the Vanguard or something like that, you know, I think it was $130 a week.
$130 a week.
But my rent was $130 a month.
Yeah, still, that's
Pretty meager.
that's a quarter of your.
Yeah, 25%.
Yeah.
Right. But the thing is, and then, you know, we do concerts, and that would pay a little bit more. If we go to Europe, he could pay me more. You know, but really, 70. My last year with Bill was 1974. I mean, I think I made $15,000 for the year.
Yeah. And you got paid for recordings, but you probably didn't get
Royalties?
Royalties
No,
or residuals.
nothing like that.
Yeah.
Nothing like
Got
that.
paid for the date.
But what, you know, since, you know, my Bill Evans days, you know, some recordings have come out. There's some tapes that were, you know, like in the closet type of thing. And so, but I did get paid for those, which was kind of nice.
Yeah.
But that's how it was, you know, like you hear the story from Jimmy Cobb all the time when he recorded Kind of Blue, you know, he got $60 for the recording date. And it's the biggest selling jazz recording in history.
Yeah.
But that's how things were set up. It was for the artist, the main artist. Right? And you were a musician, well, you got paid scale, or union scale, or whatever it was, and that's it for a record date. And,
Right.
you know, and that's just the way it is.
Have you read this Peter Pettinger, what he said about you?
I don't remember.
Unsung stalwart of piano trio history. That's you.
Okay.
Responsible for an exceedingly tight unit that could swing and drive relentlessly. His control of the 12-bar sections in a number like 12-tone tune, for instance, snappy and precise as could be.
All right, I remember that. Snappy.
Snappy.
Snappy. Very English. That's very English.
That's right.
Rather snappy.
Very snappy.
Very snappy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you moved on, and I'm wondering about what you do now with your teaching. If you look at your resume, you've done everything from the piano trio to studio work to leading your own band to playing big band, jingles. Can you impart to your students what you have to be ready for to make a living in music?
Well, that's exactly what that's our main focus in the UCF jazz program, right? With all our students, and you know, if you get a good jazz education, because to play jazz well, you really need to have your instrument under control, right? You need to be really a strong musician to play jazz well, right? You got to you have to have good technique. You have to know a lot about the music theory, especially, you know, like horn players, and we make sure our drummers they take jazz theory, and we do ear training with them, and they have to have to learn tunes. I played them on the piano
Uh-huh.
and stuff like that. So we want them to be full musicians as well, right? So, and when you get this kind of solid foundation in jazz and learning jazz, and it's a very difficult form of music to learn how to play well. I think you can take that and go go any direction in the music business and bring a lot to the table. You know, if you just focus on that particular area, you know, that's one of the reasons why I left Bill. You know, because I wanted to try to do studio work. I want to learn different styles, and you know, so I thought, well, if I could play good enough to play with Bill Evans, I should be able to take that energy and focus it somewhere else, and perhaps I should be able to do that too if I put my mind to it, you know. So you know, if you have a good jazz foundation, I think, and you're well educated, you know, in that, you know, on your instrument and that style, right? And I've gone through all the studying and everything. You know, you should be able to fall into any situation that's out there. Really, if you're interested, well, you just got, and also you got to do the homework. You got to do your research.
Who are the important rhythm sections to you that you tell your students, you got to check this out?
Well, for big band, I've always loved Mel Lewis and Richard Davis,
Yeah.
you know, and Rowan Hanna, and the early Thad Jones, Mel Lewis big band, you know, that was a great rhythm section. And then, you know, for the other big band style, I love Buddy Rich and that, what he brings to the table. Okay, of course he had a lot of different bass players and stuff, but he was the driving force in any band that he fronted, you know. So you play with him or else, right? And you know, I love the Elvin Jones and Jimmy Garrison and McCoy Tyner. That, you know, kind of Coltrane out style. You know, I love Elvin. Elvin was one of my all-time favorite drummers, jazz drummers. You know, and then then there's that Miles Davis of the '60s with Ron Carter and Tony Williams and Herbie Hancock. That's a whole other rhythm section. I mean, there's all kinds of different rhythm sections out there. So I can't say I have a favorite.
Mm-hmm.
There's lots of different rhythm sections for different kinds of music that were happening. That now I tell my students, go on YouTube and check it out. And that's a beautiful thing. They can go on YouTube and they can,
Yeah.
you know, everything's there to watch and see. You know, back in the day, I had the good fortune to go to Birdland and different clubs, and I could see them live. You know, but on YouTube, you know, they can check out 100 years of music, man. You know?
Speaking of that, I wanted to play something new that you're on.
Oh, it's Klaus Oberman, right?
This is Takana.
Oh, yes.
I love this.
That's actually Bill's solo verbatim. Like she transcribed, she transcribed the whole thing.
Oh, that's really nice.
Yeah.
That must be an interesting experience for you, because you played with him and now you're playing this.
Yeah. I was on the original
recreation.
recording. Yeah, that was a fun gig. Takana Miyamoto, she's a great piano player, and we went to Japan, and it was actually on that tour that I met my wife, Michiko. You know.
Outstanding.
Yeah, and we did Bill Evans tribute kind of tour. We did some gigs over there, concerts, and she's a wonderful pianist, great. And that one, you know, she transcribed it, and just played it verbatim, the entire solo.
And
Amazing.
did you try to play verbatim?
No, I don't remember. Yeah, I don't remember from one day to the next what I played the last time. Yeah.
But the recordings I picked out to listen, I'm not sure how to say this. You like to double things up a lot, or frequently.
Double things up.
Double things up by for instance, that piece, it seems like you could have been playing. You were fairly busy on the snare drum with the brushes.
Right.
I guess that's what I mean.
Right. Well, that's kind of what I hear, and that's a very stylistic, Bill Evans style. You know.
Yeah.
And it's a conversation.
I like it
rather than an accompaniment.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
You know what I mean? It's kind of a conversation rather than just, and that's basically, you know, like that early trio with Scott LaFaro, Paul Modian, and Bill. You know, they created a whole new rhythm section kind of style, right? Where they were three musicians having a conversation, rather than the bass and the drummer accompanying the piano player. Right? So that's when kind of the door started opening for the role of the drummer and the bass player, the interaction in a rhythm section.
I like that. Because it sounded like a ballad and an up-tempo tune at the same time to me. It's very interesting.
Yeah. That's a beautiful piece of music. That's Klaus Ogerman.
I was going to know, I say, boy, you played with him and you played with Don Sebesky, who's one of my favorite writers. And
yeah.
Cool.
I did a lot of dates with, we're playing one of his tracks, Sammy Nestico.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he was up, he used to come up to, I lived in, you probably know, I lived in Canada for about 25 years. And he used to come up to do projects up there. And unfortunately, he always asked for me in the rhythm section, so that was pretty nice. And I did a lot of dates, a lot of sessions and recordings with Sammy. Sammy's a great writer, amazing writer.
Yeah. Neat guy, too.
Yeah, he's a sweetheart.
Yeah.
He's still active. He's like 92 or 93 or something. He's still writing. It's amazing.
And Broadway shows and being in the pit, a whole other focus of,
absolutely.
You know,
yeah,
not only playing time, but being on time and
right
structure of it.
Right. Well, you know, I like the steadiness of it, right? And I like the, you know, financially, I mean, it's good money, right? And also it's all union contracts, so it's all pension. You know. And you know, I learned about that like early, and I wanted to make sure that I did those kind of gigs that I would have some retirement.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm glad I did. Not only was it fun musically, I mean, it was, you know, it was cool playing with a 28-piece orchestra every night and playing the show. You know.
Right.
It's a lot of fun. I mean, yeah, you need to be disciplined, and you know, you can't you know, cut loose or whatever. You know, you have to play the gig the way it's meant to be played, right? It's almost the same every night, you know. I like that, you know, it was kind of for me, it was stress-free. You know, you just go in, you don't have to deal with people in a club or something like that. You're in the pit, nobody really sees you. You do your gig, you know, and then you know, then you go home. You can have kind of a normal life.
I've heard
And
some
the money's good.
and seen some things about how a drummer I know said he did a show once and he wasn't even in the pit. He was in another room watching a conductor on
A monitor, yeah, I've done that.
Have you done that?
Yeah, I've done that, yes, with earphones.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that's kind of weird. I haven't done that too much, fortunately.
Yeah.
But you know, that's some of the pits on Broadway are so small. The theaters are old, right? So there's not enough room. So they gotta rig something up like in the back there and put a drummer or a percussionist in another room, right? So, but it, you know, it's actually if you have a good sound man, right, and they give you a good mix, it sounds like you're playing on a recording every night. I mean, it sounds great. You got good earphones, and it sounds like you're right in the middle of a beautifully recorded CD.
Yeah.
And now, if you have a sound man that doesn't know what he's doing, and then it can be really funky. You know, it'd be a disaster. Right. But if you have a good mix, you know, that can be pretty nice.
What's the worst gig you ever played?
The worst gig?
The worst. Sometimes I use this question, and usually people, it's hard to remember.
Well, fortunately, I haven't had too many that were bad. Of course, early on, I did a gig in a place called the Idea Lounge in the Bronx, and it was drums and a guitar, two guitars, and the two guitar players were standing at, like there was kind of a U-shaped bar, and they're standing in the middle of the bar, and the drums were on a riser outside on the other side of the bar, right? So I'm playing, and a guy comes in, and he hangs his coat on my cymbal. Right? Of course, I was like, 17, 18 years old or something like that. And you know drummer Pete Magadini?
I've seen the name, yeah.
Yeah. Well, Pete is a friend of mine. He told me he actually worked at Idea Lounge too, and we exchanged stories of that place. But I can't remember the worst gig I ever played. Fortunately, they just kept getting better and better. You know, like early, and I always enjoyed my work. I always enjoyed the next gig. If there were any that were bad, I dropped. I can't even remember.
Yeah, it's just a day at work, and tomorrow will be another day.
Yeah, exactly. I tell the story to some of my students. When I first moved to Canada, this piano player called me to work a gig at a Holiday Inn, and I was new in town, so I didn't have a whole bunch of work right away. But he was doing this gig, and he had to do an hour show behind an Irish singer who played ukulele and a bunch of drunk Irish people, right? And he called me and said, I just thought outside chance that maybe you'd want to, fill in for my drummer for 2 weeks, And he explained about the gig, right? And, but we could play 2 tunes before the show. And I'd love to, work with you. I said, sure. I wasn't doing anything, and he was really a nice guy. And so, I went, did the gig, and, made a few bucks, the 2 weeks, and made a friend, and we hung out. We played a couple of tunes before, and it was nice. It was, we were laughing during the show, and everybody, it was kind of a joke, really, But sometimes it's about friendship and camaraderie and other fellow musicians, and and so it was nice to make friends with somebody, right? And so at the end of the 2 weeks, we parted, and that was it, right? But a couple of years later, he calls me, and he says, Marty, are you available to do, I just booked this TV show series, and I'm going to be musical director, and I'd love for you to do the series. And I said, sure, So meanwhile, that gig, just paid a bunch of money, and I said, thank you so much. You were the first person I thought of to call.
Wow, all those years later.
Yeah, and that's kind of a karma thing, So I tell that story to my students. So if you bring something good, it's about the human experience more than that. You know what I mean? And that's more important. And we're musicians, and sometimes we have to share something that's kind of funky, but the sun will rise the next morning. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
And it's only 4 hours of the day.
Really?
And it's what we do. We're musicians, so okay,
Yeah.
it's something else come along that's better.
Yes. I sometimes think of the people that work 8 hours a day. It's something that they really dislike.
Absolutely.
And then you compare what we do.
Right,
and
right.
It puts things in perspective.
Absolutely. And I always appreciated having work and being able to do what I do to make a living, And I think that if you approach your work with a positive kind of a attitude, I think good things kind of fall into place. And I just kind of the way I am, you know, like I wasn't, it wasn't that I had a motive or something for, you know, that thing, oh, this guy's gonna call me for some TV show thing. I never thought about that, you know what I mean? But it's important to enjoy the people that you work with, and that's what's nice about our business, you know, it's a very social kind of thing, you know, and for me, that was more than, you know, and he was a fine writer. I could tell he was a good piano player. You know, he was a really good musician. You know, he had to pay his bills, so he was doing this gig, right? So
A gig is a gig.
A gig is a gig.
Yeah.
That's just the way it is, you know. So I mean, fortunately, you know, I think if you play your cards right, everything works out, and something good comes out of it.
Cool. What do you do if a student comes to you with a recording that they really like, and the drums and the percussion are all electronically created?
Well, you know, as Duke Ellington once said, he said, there's only two kinds of music. There's good music and there's bad music. All right? So it depends on what they're doing with it. I mean, if it's musically, if there's something happening and it's cool, you know,
Mm-hmm.
I'd say great. It sounds, you know, I don't close the door, and you know,
Yeah.
for me it's about what is the overall thing saying, what's happening with it, you know. I mean, if it's just thumping on one chord, you know, over and over again, it's saying very, very uninteresting, you know. I'm going to tell the student, oh man, I think this sucks, you know, like, you know,
Yeah.
get it off, you know. But I mean, you know, you have to keep an open mind. I mean, if it's interesting, I mean, you hear a lot of things that are, you know, they're pretty cool. It's very well done. The use of electronic, like the computer-style music,
Yeah.
you know.
Do your students do that as part of their instruction?
Not really.
Okay.
No, we do formal training, pretty much. Some of them do it on their own, although we do have music technology courses where they learn how to use Logic and some of the sequencing software that's out
Right.
there, right? So they do learn to do that, right? And I think that has its place as well. You know, you should try to understand that too, because that could be a mode of a little income there. If you get good at it, you know, you can earn some money writing and doing some charts or whatever, or
Right.
a track for somebody. We recently did a track for a friend of ours at Cirque du Soleil, electronic
Oh,
kind of style, and we were commissioned to do that, so we did it. You know, so it's good to understand that part of it too.
right. Put one more thing in the things
Yeah.
you can do.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. This is not a musical question, but how are you feeling about the state of our country these days?
Right now,
Yeah.
oh, I think it's terrible. I think with what's happening now with this administration is absolutely awful. I think it's a crying shame. And I was really, really, really disheartened, you know,
Mm-hmm.
how this whole thing went down. You know, I think it's awful. I really do. And you know, it's going to start cutting all the endowment for the arts
Yeah.
and all those things, and all, you know, those don't matter. Well, we'll give money to the football teams and stuff like that. That's better, you know. And it's really sad. It's rough, you know, because I'm a political junkie. I watch the news all the time. Every day I got to get up and see, well, what happened yesterday?
Yeah.
I'm always, you know.
I was
But
doing
recently,
that.
I actually switched the channel.
Me too.
Yeah, I can't believe what I'm hearing, what I'm seeing.
Right. You feel like withdrawing.
Yeah, it's like, what the hell? What is this, man? And people actually buy this?
And you live in a state that has played like a role.
Yes, I
hasn't
know.
it? Yeah.
I know. Yeah, that's another thing too, you know. But one thing about being a musician, we're kind of our own community. And we kind of, we have our own little universe, you know. and it's a nice place to be,
Yeah.
right? And that's always been my kind of salvation. When I was a kid, like being a musician, you know, like that was always a place I could go to. That was made me feel good, and it was comfortable.
Uh-huh.
And I had friends in that same circle, right? So it was always a place of comfort, and it still is, even more so now.
When you go home, do you turn on music? You listen to music a lot?
Sometimes, yeah, sometimes we do. We recently haven't, you know, because usually at dinner we try to turn off the news and listen to some music. You know, I have some LPs and I have an old turntable.
Yeah.
And I like to check out some of the old LPs. Recently I've been listening to, while driving, I'm trying to put together a CD. I just recorded my first vibraphone CD. You know, I'm trying to play vibes for the last 5 or 6 years. I've always played mallets, you know, but to put out a good, worthy of, you know, some recognition. It's difficult. There's so much stuff out there. So many great players. Mm-hmm. So I've been listening and mixing and getting you know, how I'm going to do this or that. And I have to do another session to get a few more tracks done. So that's what I've been listening to. I usually listen to music I'm working on my own.
Oh. Did you happen to work with Peter Appleyard?
Yes.
Over in Canada?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I worked with Peter Appleyard. He was a good musician.
Yes, he was.
An excellent musician. Good player, you know. He actually, when he's working with Benny Goodman, you know, so I sat in, you know, he introduced me to Benny, and I sat in and played a set with Benny Goodman. So that was nice. Peter was a fine man. He really was. He was a gentleman, and when he wanted to, he could really play. I mean, he was caught up in the theatrics and you know, a lot, you know. But down deep, he was a really good musician.
Yeah.
Good player.
And I see you played with Marian McPartland somewhere along.
Yeah, way back in the day. Yeah, I played with her. Right, but that was, you know, what happened with Marian. That was during the time I was playing with Steve Kuhn, and we had just done an album with Gary McFarland, a thing called October Suite. Ron Carter was the bass player, and I was working with Marian, and I had to take a couple of nights off, and I sent in a friend of mine to sub for me, right? This guy named Jimmy Kappas, and then on the next gig, he was, you know, so I got axed by Marian, you know, but you know, I think what happened was that I was maybe trying to stretch out a little bit too much. She wanted more mainstream, just a little more solid kind of a, you know, and I was young and, you know, a little bit cocky, and, you know, and I tried to push her a little bit.
What was that thing Lester Young
where
said?
she didn't want to go.
Some quote from Lester Young. Just tickety-tick for Lester, no, don't be dropping no bombs or something.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess I got a little too adventurous,
Yeah.
you know. But she was really sweet, you know. She sent me some sheet music, some tunes that I liked, and you know, and that's fine. Sometimes it's just, it doesn't work out, you know. And it didn't bother me.
Right.
Because I was recording playing with Steve Kuhn and Ron
Yeah,
Carter.
that was some nice music.
It was different, that recording was.
Yeah. Well, you know how to drive a big band. I can say that because I've been rehearsing with this group tonight.
Yeah, great.
You know, and now I can put on my resume that I played with you.
Oh, okay. Cool.
You have anything else that you'd like to add before we sign off?
You know, it's nice to, you know, nice to be asked about my past and my history. You know, I'm flattered every time somebody's interested.
Yeah.
You know, and it's I enjoy it. I enjoy revisiting the days, or you know, and if somebody can learn something from it or get something out of it,
right?
That's great. That's
well,
nice.
I liked what you said about, you know, attitude bringing professionalism as well as friendship to a gig, because it just adds to the good karma. And
Absolutely.
sometimes it yields something down the road, and sometimes it doesn't. But
Right, but it doesn't matter. You made a friend, you know,
Right.
and that's more important.
And when you think about, playing with Bill Evans and these other people, that's sort of like a basketball player getting to the NBA. For me, that's the way I sort of think of how many people want to get there and never quite do. And
Right,
so
right.
to have those experiences, you may not even realize it at the time. I think you probably
Yes,
did.
I know. I was like walking on air when I got the gig with Bill, because but after a while, you do take it for granted, like and I used to talk with Eddie sometimes and say, man, I wish he would play some different tunes, man. We get on, like that type of thing, right?
Sure.
You get a little bit like jaded, but I appreciate it more now.
Yeah.
And I listen to some of the old recordings, and I can actually be objective, because back then I was never said, man, I sound terrible.
Really?
I wasn't happening. It wasn't happening at all. But I can listen and say, no, it wasn't too bad. It was pretty good, actually. You know what I mean? You can be more objective now.
Right. Yeah.
So, in 1973, we did the Bill Evans album, right? And it was done at Columbia Studios, the famous studio, 30th Street. That's where Kind of Blue was recorded, right? It was like it was an old church, and it was the studio in New York to record it, and Bill recorded there. And we did this session, and I walk in, and there's these blankets. They made a room for the drums, and I couldn't even see Bill. And they had like 15 mics on the drums, and they said, you do this and do that and tape this, and and I said, but that's not my sound. Oh, no, but don't worry, we're going to fix it in the mix. It's going to be, it'll be fine. So, we start recording. I can't even see Bill. I got to, just go by whatever he plays an intro, and then I pick it up, And when I listened to the finished product, it sounded like there were 3 guys playing in 3 different rooms. And that's what was happening, right? Because there has to be some kind of little bit of bleed to get that nice togetherness, where it sounds like one unit, right? Not 3 separate guys, right? So I wasn't really happy with that at all, right? But wouldn't you know what that recording won a Grammy Award?
Yeah, isn't that something?
1973.
Yeah.
So then I thought, what the hell do I know? I don't know.
It's funny because I just was thinking, I was wondering if you'd ever run into like producers who wanted to do a thing a certain way, and you're saying, well, musically that's not perhaps the best way to do this, and it's not the way we work either. But
Well, if you're playing music that's very personal to you, and it's about your sound and what you're bringing to the table, then a good producer should see that and let that happen naturally, right?
Mm-hmm.
They don't want to put you in a box that sound like everybody else. They'll get the drum sound that everybody else gets.
Yeah.
So it depends on the kind of music. When you're doing the studio work, it's kind of generic sounding, like pop and that kind of thing. I can understand that. There's not a lot of personality, individual personality in that kind of music, right? But in the jazz thing, where it's more, there's more talking going on and more conversation.
Right.
You want to speak in terms of the way you feel about things, and your sound is part of what you're bringing to the table, right? And when they try to change that up, then I have a little problem with that.
Right. Well, thanks for your time today.
Sure.
Look forward to playing with you later tonight.
Well, thank you.
All right.
Appreciate it. Thanks a lot, man.